To many people, the French novelist Marcel Proust is the greatest and most influential novelist in any language of the past 100 years or so. This is a big claim to make. He's certainly not the best-selling novelist. What is less disputable is the idea that to enjoy his work to the full, the more you know about his life, the better. This is the case with all writers to some extent, but with Proust it is so to an unparalleled degree. His work is all about his past, the experiences he has had, often in the minutest detail, the many people he has known, their characters, their foibles, their appearance, their habits. What is also true is that none of his characters are modelled on any one person. They are an amalgam of several people, several physical traits, personal characteristics and situations, and it is this reworking of memory that is in fact the subject of his novels. To some extent all writers did this before Proust, and all writers have certainly done it since. It is arguable, however, that no one has done it with such charm, wit, intelligence and perception, and certainly no writer has produced work which has such a profound effect upon his readers. Proust's major work, La Recherche du Temps Perdu, is known in English as Remembrance of Things Past. It is in 12 sturdy volumes, and it is undoubtedly a daunting task to begin it. However, as you get drawn into it, the daunting bit comes to be the thought of it finally coming to an end. Marcel Proust was born the first child of a successful Parisian doctor, a Catholic but not very devout Christian, married to a strong-minded but not very devout Jewess. Every little detail in Proust's biography counts, so we should know that the doctor was quite well off, and Proust was to inherit enough money to live comfortably without working for the rest of his life. For people with a certain political angle on life, perhaps this fact will put them off Proust at once. How does a man in such circumstances write about life with any real understanding? D.H. Lawrence, an English contemporary, was born the son of a coal miner. He must have known about life, you might argue. In fact, the two writers from very different backgrounds finished up with a great deal more in common than their different starting points would lead us to expect. Lawrence certainly wrote well about coal miners, but in the end he married an aristocrat, and what interested him was human relationships in real-life situations, whatever they were. This is exactly Proust's viewpoint. His birth, his money, his connections led him into the society of the rich and idle at what was considered by some to be the top of French society. The imaginary world he created from this unique experience is now there to enrich us all, if we only trouble to look past the veneer. We don't have to look far to know about the seminal experiences of Proust's early life. The family lived here in the Boulevard Malherbe, in the 7th arrondissement in Paris. The Église Saint-Augustin dominates the end of the street, and their apartment was number 9, above some shops, and like thousands of other blocks in the area, which had been so drastically remodelled by Baron Haussmann under the Emperor Louis Napoleon. This was a small, select area of the city, centred perhaps on the Madeleine Church. Proust was to spend the whole of his life in this area. The nearby cafes were his haunts. In his day it was considered to be extremely modern and up-to-date, and the upper echelons of society were moving house from the old Faubourg hotels of the left bank to this new and prosperous area. Here Proust could see the latest motor cars, an area in which France led the world. The telephone was installed everywhere around here from 1885. From 1900, the wonderful Art Nouveau-style entrances to the Underground Railway were appearing. Of course, in 1889, Eiffel had constructed his tower for the Universal Exhibition, probably unaware that it would so come to symbolize Paris. Indeed, at this time, more than any other, the city was leading the world in technological and social advance. Looked at in this light, it is hardly surprising that Proust looked no further than the immediate and extraordinary world he found around him. Proust's father, Dr. Adrien Proust, worked at La Charité Hospital. He was much respected and commanded large fees from those he could pay. His special contribution to medicine lay in his understanding of infection and the need to work in the most hygienic conditions, for which he developed many systems and techniques. He was also a much-loved husband and father, quick to understand the remarkable gifts of both his sons and ready to encourage them as he could. Proust's younger brother Robert became a prominent physician like his father, and the brothers remained close throughout their lives. Mothers often have special relationships with one of their children, and Madame Proust was Marcel's linchpin throughout her long life. As a child, he worshipped her, and his need for her attention and the various ways in which he engaged it are well documented in his novel Jean Santeuil, as well as in La Recherche du Temps Perdu. She was Jeanne Weil, the cultured and beautiful daughter of a Jewish stockbroker. The fact that she married a Catholic doctor and that the children were brought up as Catholics suggests that she did not lay too much emphasis on her being Jewish. However, in that Marcel was so closely attached to her, it is tempting to think that she had a bit of the dominating Jewish mama about her. For Marcel, being part Jewish might have meant exclusion from the society he entered. But in fact his own charm, his unusual but handsome appearance as a young man, the fact that his father was so well known and respected, ensured that he found entry more or less where he wanted. Dr. Adrien had a sister, Elizabeth, married to Jules Amiot. They lived in the village of Illiers, and when the boys were young, they frequently spent their summers in this delightful place, not far from Chartres. Aunt Elizabeth was an invalid and spent her time in her room. The boys were free to roam as they wished, and their roaming took them around the town, whose landmarks were to become enshrined in Marcel's novels in his imaginary village of Cambrai. As we roam through the early parts of La Recherche du Temps Perdu, we come upon the church. Large and beautiful like so many such buildings in France, with a splendid tower and bells. This is his uncle's garden, which the uncle named Pré Catalan, after a garden in the Bois de Boulogne. For the children it was a magical place. The garden was some way from the house, and most importantly, there were two ways by which it could be reached. The Guermantes way, by the river Loir, and so named because of the ducal family of the Guermantes, which plays an important part in his work. It represents the way of high society, into which the narrator in the novel moves. The other way is the way of Swann, another major figure in the novel, representing a more personal affirmation of love and personal satisfaction in life. Back home in Paris, the boys went to school, of course, principally the Lycée Condorcet, known at this time for its independence of mind, and certainly in the group in which Marcel grew up, producing a rare type of student. Here is a class picture. Marcel figured well at school, particularly when it came to essay writing. His close friends included Daniel Alevet, son of the composer Alevet, and Jacques Bizet, son of the composer Bizet. Bizet's mother had married again after her husband's early death, a rich businessman called Strauss, and as Madame Strauss came to have one of the most prominent salons in Paris. Proust first went there, aged 17. She obviously recognized his talent and became his principal gateway to society. She remained a lifelong friend. In his early teens, a most significant part of his life was the time he spent playing with friends in the nearby Parc Monceau, or in the gardens of the Champs-Élysées. Here he is in the Parc Monceau with one of the girls with whom he fell deeply in love, Antoinette IV, whose father was to become President of France some 10 years later. He was about 13 at this time. His breathless and youthful adoration of Antoinette, and later Marie Bernardacchi, whom he met in the Champs-Élysées gardens, is wonderfully evoked in his novels. Marie's father was a Polish count who had made a fortune selling tea. Either his parents put a stop to the relationship, or he finally realized that she didn't love him enough. Proust remembered her for the rest of his days and saw her as one of the great loves of his life. Such affairs continued throughout his teens. Very often he worshipped from afar. The Countess Chévigné was such a one. A very striking woman of fashion, he had met her at Madame Strauss's salon and began to haunt the street where she walked every day, pretending to accidentally meet her and doffing his hat politely. She was ultimately to be the model for one of his most important characters. In his last years at school, Marcel took part in the production of one or two literary magazines. The Revue Verte was produced as one handwritten copy, handed round to the select few who might care to read it. Marcel, of course, wrote for it, as he did for their next venture, the Revue Lila, named after the colour of the exercise books in which it was written. Daniel Alevet was the editor, and he was to go on editing magazines all his life, including the famous and long-running Cahier Vert, which, in its 68th edition, printed Souvenirs sur Marcel Proust by their schoolfellow Robert Dreyfus. These were the beginnings of Proust's career as a writer, but he was still more concerned with collecting the observations which would be the basis of his work. Holiday time took him to the Normandy coast, and the world he found there was to be yet another focal point for his later work. He called the area Baalbek. People went there to enjoy the sea air, to swim, to play tennis, to fall in love, to go to parties, to see the surrounding countryside in trips in their new automobiles. All of this became a rich fount of atmosphere and social observation for Proust. He went there to stay in Cabourg with his mother or grandmother. His grandmother seems to have been a formidable lady of character. But it was the groups of girls playing tennis or walking on the promenade who caught his eye. The unique world of the luxury seaside hotel with its huge staff pandering to the often odd wishes of its generally idle guests, its grand restaurants, the ebb and flow of the seasons. All these were to fill Proust's memory and become templates for the unfolding of his stories. People walked on the beaches or on the cliffs, visited the local sites. Some were only there for a short time, some for many weeks in the summer. Others took houses and stayed half the year. But they all had a transient relationship with the place which gave their lives a special quality. With no ties of work or family to Balbec, character and personality were much more significant. Somehow everyone moved on to the same level. Proust's feeling for and representation of all this is uncannily powerful. From the very start of his entry into adulthood, Proust made society, with a capital S, the ground for his activities. Amongst his erstwhile schoolfellows, this was generally looked on as snobbery, and until his La Recherche du Temps Perdu came to be read and understood, he never escaped from the accusation. We are all snobs in some way, and at some time in our lives. All of us humans are keen to rise, or at least to enter some group from which we see ourselves as at first excluded. We make concessions to this ideal, whatever it is, which makes us snobs. If we are in a group, we sometimes try to ensure our position by looking down on those whom we perceive as not being in this group. In this we are being snobbish. Group snobbery can even mean that people born into poverty feel that poverty is a special experience, so they will not take heed of others who have never experienced poverty. Proust was well aware of this from an early age, and had no illusions about his acceptability in society. He was personable, charming, witty, and extremely intelligent, and with certain people this turned out to be passport enough to outweigh any matters of birth or social level. He could afford all the right clothes, tipped servants extravagantly, knew when to send the appropriate gift or letter or telegram, and was always ready with some aphorism which set people laughing or smiling. He was lucky to have a few excellent introductions at the right moment, and he remained until the end of his life sought after and accepted by discerning people as a wonderful person to have around. Proust biographers have a great time identifying the models for his characters amongst the people he knew. Who was the model for the Duchess de Germont? Possibly one of his early loves, Madame de Chévigné, the woman whom he waited for in the street near her house. And the Baron de Châlus? He is an extremely well-born and well-connected baron, who turns out to be homosexual and quite rapacious in following his tastes. Reading descriptions of him in the novel, this cartoon of one of society's characters of the time seems about right. But Robert de Montesquieu, quite different in appearance, but otherwise homosexual, rapacious, cultured, and above all a close friend of Proust, was probably a major source for the Baron's character. De Montesquieu was a writer of modest talent, but connected to everyone, so in a multitude of ways he was a source for Proust's characters. Then there was Swann, a major figure in the early parts of the novel. Someone like Charles Haas is always brought out as the model for Swann. The girl Albertine, whom the narrator loves, certainly grew out of the many girls Proust knew and loved in his early years in Paris and on the Normandy coast. This picture of girls at leisure in some seaside place seems to capture the world Proust's girls inhabit. As an artist who saw and felt life on so many planes, he would surely be happy to see a painter who could reflect things so sensitively. As far as love went, Proust needed to love and be loved, just like most of the rest of us. Early love affairs with women, no matter how intense and moving, never seemed to come to anything, and in his early 20s he began what was to be a series of affairs with men. Reynaldo Hahn, a young composer and singer from Argentina, was one of these with whom Proust was passionately involved for a time. After a couple of years, it faded. Then Lucien Daudet, son of the novelist Alphonse Daudet. Both of these men remained staunch friends to the end of Proust's life. Proust began having his work published quite early on, but in retrospect he was mostly preparing for his great work of the future. He wrote for journals, essays on literary subjects, a large biographical novel, Jean sans taille, never finished. He published a volume of short stories called Les Plaisirs et les Jours in 1896, works on architecture. He was fascinated by the English writer John Ruskin, who wrote about architecture as a reflection of the times in which it was executed. He translated Ruskin's famous work The Stones of Venice, visiting the city to seep up the vision that Ruskin had drawn for him. He was drawn to Ruskin by the practicality of his work. Ruskin did many drawings to illustrate his themes and was always ready to draw comparisons between these practical elements and the spiritual themes of man's nature. Proust found Venice a profound experience, and the fact that it is so visual is totally in keeping with the minute observation and description of his writing. Proust went to the Cathedral of Amiens, about which Ruskin had also written, and immediately set to work translating this too. It came out as La Bible d'Amiens in 1904. In the 90s, the Dreyfus affair came to dominate the French political and social scene. Dreyfus, a Jew, was wrongly accused of passing information to France's arch-enemies, the Germans. Although it fairly soon became clear to Proust and lots of others that another man altogether was behind it, the top brass of the army didn't want to climb down. It was a sorry tale of spite, anti-Semitism and corruption, and Proust was forceful in his support of Dreyfus. Of course, most of society sided with the generals, who were a part of them, and Proust's position, he was, after all, half Jewish himself, might have suffered. However, it didn't. His virtues outweighed the force of his opinions, and he continued to be invited. Music was deeply important to Proust, and he followed new developments closely, again mirrored in his work, where the work of his imaginary composer Valentin plays a significant part. The composers of his day were Wagner and Brahms, and amongst the French, Fauré, Debussy, Ravel, and Saint-Saëns. Saint-Saëns, although of lesser stature, was reckoned to be the model for Valentin. It is abundantly clear that for Proust all forms of art had meaning, and in his books they all flow into and out of each other, all struggling, as he was, to encapsulate and illuminate the life of mankind in some way. For some reason, it all came to a head in 1910 or 11. By 1911, he had 800 pages of his novel ready to publish. He began to seek a publisher. For anyone, it is a huge task. 2 publishers turned him down flat, including NRF, Nouvelle Revue Française, which was in fact the novelist and his friend André Gide. Gide's company had hardly even read the manuscript, and later Gide was to see it as the greatest mistake of his life. Proust was driven to offer it to a publisher, Grasset, who agreed to put it out, providing Proust himself covered the costs of publication. Grasset later admitted that he did not even read the manuscript at all. By November 1913, Du Côté de Chez Swann was to be published. It got good reviews from some of his literary friends, and Gide read it properly this time. Immediately he wrote apologizing profoundly for his error and wanting to become Proust's publisher. Obviously Grasset would have to be got round, but at this point the war intervened. Proust was affected by the war as much as anyone. He had had experience of the army in his youth and felt a soldierly affinity with the men going off to war. The war changed everything in France as it did elsewhere. It is not hard to argue that the war, with its huge social upheaval, as well as the divisions and devastation which went with it, prepared the world for the kind of sensibility Proust had, as nothing else did. After the war, things were no longer as cut and dried, or black and white, as they had been before it. In 1914, Gide was able to publish parts of Le Côté de Guermantes, but it was not until 1919 and the war over that the next part of the work came out, À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs. It won the Prix Goncourt, and of course Proust was then on the literary map. The next year the whole of Le Côté de Guermantes came out, and he was given the Légion d'honneur. From being considered an amateur writer to this, in a few years, was a pretty substantial step. Proust's last years were so plagued by bouts of asthma and his determination to finish what he had begun, that it would seem to most of us that this hermit, who slept by day and worked at night, led a dismal existence. His walls were lined with cork to keep out the noise of the daytime world. He could hardly go out without getting attacks of breathlessness. His friends could only see him if they went at unsociable midnight hours. He never found anyone to love and be loved by on a stable basis. However, his work was his life. Through it he lived, and that the world is a richer and more humane place because of the work of this remarkable man is without doubt. Anyone who reads the books of Marcel Proust will never be quite the same again. A peculiar warmth and humour pervades them. He sees round so many corners of human life. He mercilessly uncovers hypocrisy and evil, as well as charm and intelligence, of course. But he does so with wit and sensitivity, and above all generosity of spirit, so that we know that Marcel Proust's life was as rich and full as any life can be, and we are the better for it. Marcel Proust was not a prolific writer, if we look at the number of titles he published. Apart from journalistic pieces and 2 translations of work by the English art historian John Ruskin, in 1896, when he was 25, he published a volume of short stories called Les Plaisirs et les Jours. It got little attention, and he was considered, even by Anatole France, who wrote the introduction, to be a writer who lures us into a hothouse where there are orchids whose strange and unhealthy beauty has no roots in the soil. Such praise didn't do Proust much good. He also wrote a large, unfinished and quite autobiographical novel, Jean Santeuil, which was not published until some time after his death. It is fascinating as a background to the great work he was finally to write. His major work went under the overall title of À la Recherche du Temps Perdu, and the individual titles of the parts in French and English are as follows: Du côté de chez Swann, Swann's Way; Albertine disparue, Albertine lost; Sodom et Gomorrhe, Sodom and Gomorrah; La prisonnière, the prisoner; Temps retrouvé, time regained; À l'ombre des jeunes filles en fleurs, in the shade of young girls in flower; Le côté de Guermantes, the Guermantes way. Le côté de Guermantes and Sodom and Gomorrah were published in 2 parts. The novel tells of the narrator's experiences of love and society in an extraordinarily detailed and sensitive way. A whole lot of tales weave their way in and out through the various volumes. This work has made its mark on world literature as few others have done. For anyone who wants to read it, the only thing to do is not to be daunted, but start at the beginning with Swann's Way, and Proust's magic will do the rest.